studied sociology, but during my high school and college years, I worked as a reporter of school newspaper. I was in college. I developed social consciousness being a reporter of the school newspaper, as well as I joined a club, what we called club at the time, to study history and social issues. And at the time, I wrote an article after interviewing the bus conductors, who were women mostly. And then that was probably my first human rights education, because these female bus conductors were perceived as potential thievers, to steal the bus token. Yeah, so there was a search, bodily search of them to check whether they stole any money from the bus fee. And I interviewed one of these girls, bus conductors, and they were very ashamed of those being perceived as thieves. So, I wrote about that, and I think that was when I really developed the concept of human rights violation. Yeah, and then after graduation, I worked for 1 year at university as a research assistant to save money for my graduate study. And then while I was a graduate student, I joined a women's organization, worked full-time as a staff of women's organization, doing my study and work together for 7 years. Yeah. And then I decided to go abroad for further study. So I was deeply connected with women's movement, and then that's what I returned after I got my degree and worked as a professor at the university. So I continued my activism, making laws regarding sexual violence, domestic violence, trafficking. As I continued almost 2-3 jobs at the same time, combining my position as a professor, teaching full-time, and then also worked as a woman human rights person, making laws and then raising the issue of so-called comfort woman to the UN. I was so busy, I couldn't go on like that, so I resigned from the faculty position. And then Korean government suggested me whether I would be interested in becoming a member of SIDO Committee, which I learned while I was in the United States. And of course, I had the experience of submitting shadow report, NGO report to the SIDO Committee when Korea was reviewed in 1998, yeah? So I said yes, and that's how I became the member of the SIDO, which was great in reviewing the various states parties to the convention on their implementation of the convention. Regarding their laws, policies, and what are their measures to fight against not only the legal and formal discrimination, but also cultural discrimination or harmful practices, for example. So during my 8-year work on the SIDO Committee, I think I reviewed more than 100 reports by various states parties, submitted to the committee, and also individual communication cases, as well as the drafting and adopting of general recommendation by the SIDO Committee. So it was a great learning experience, and also I was happy to be connected with the women's movement organizations from various countries, which I had worked for. So it was great time, and I think SIDO Committee experts are really committed, and spent a lot of time working, trying to bring changes into the national policies and laws. And I think I really enjoyed and felt really fruitful those 8 years for 2 terms. The so-called comfort women are euphemistically the slaves of the Japanese Imperial Army, which was engaged in Asia-Pacific War from 1932 to 1945. Japan was an expanding imperialistic country at that time. And then Taiwan and Korea fell as a colony of Japan, unfortunately. But Japan also invaded China and many other parts of Asia and the Pacific. And then they even attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941 against the United States. So the whole Asia was the battlefield for the Japanese invasion. And comfort women were used as sex slaves of the Japanese army wherever the army went. So they were recruited, drafted, deceived, forced, or sometimes kidnapped by, it can be personal trafficker, or it can be even by their own parents, but sold into this sexual slavery, because the whole Japanese system of maintaining the military was to bring these women to the battlefield so that the Japanese army would not rape the local women, would keep their high morale, as well as to prevent venereal diseases. So it was their logic. But under this false logic and serious and real human violation of these women, Japan continued to fight and invading, and up to estimated 200,000 women were recruited as comfort women, who were mostly from poor families, because well-off families could avoid, and it was those with family background, with very low poor families from the rural countryside. And especially for Korea, because Korea was the colony of Japan, there was this Japanese governor who controlled Korea. So we were under constant surveillance by the Japanese police, who are, exercising their power and control. And we, Korean people, were even forbidden to speak our own languages, so at schools, the students were forced to use only Japanese, learn Japanese, and Korean history class was forbidden. And we were even forced to change our names into Japanese style. So everything was forbidden. And during this colonial period from Taiwan and Korea, especially from Korea, women were recruited and trafficked and then moved, by the Japanese vessels or with the permission of the Japanese government. Most of them were killed or deserted, and those who were lucky enough to return to Korea, Taiwan, China, or other victimized countries, they had to live in isolation and stigmatized and having serious financial difficulty, of course. I think justice is the most important thing. When your rights are violated, you feel anger, you feel frustration, you feel shame. You have all this inner psychology that comes from this violation. You lose your dignity, self-esteem, pride, etc. So justice is the recognition that something wrong was done, and that should be punished. Yeah. And then compensation comes as a natural consequence of this justice. If anything illegal and violation is done towards you, then the recognition and justice almost always have to bring compensation because of the damages done to you. Yeah. So I think justice is really important, but compensation. And when one of the comfort woman victim testified in Japan back in the 90s, there was a Japanese reporter who asked openly, because it was a public testimony, so how much money do you want? That was so hurting to this survivor. You know, no money can bring back her ruined youth and ruined life. Yeah, but it was so rude question. But of course, compensation is a least expression of the recognition of the harm done to the survivor or victim of violation of human rights. I think the first challenge was to step forward, to reveal yourself, to say to the world that you suffered as comfort woman, because it brings all the shame under the patriarchal norms of the society that you were raped constantly and you were slaves. No? So that means you lost your virginity, you lost your chastity, you cannot bear any child, and you cannot marry. And to say that to the world needs real courage. And especially if there are real group of people who believes that, you know, you are the fallen woman, or you are the one who should be blamed, you know, because you didn't behave in the right way. And I think that was the real challenge for the former comfort woman to come forward. So that is why there should be a strong support, social support for women victims of rape, slavery, or trafficking, or whatever, you know, so that whenever she felt shame, there should be a social movement that should say that, no, it's not your fault. It's the fault of the aggressor, those who violated you. It's not your fault, but you need that kind of social support. I think the current challenge is that still, after 30 years, there is no recognition by the Japanese government that they violated international human rights law. They say legally everything is solved, you know, and then at the same time, Japan is trying to hide the history in their textbooks, you know, in their public statement, etc. So I think that is the great challenge. What do you do when democracy goes back, and when there is authoritarian rule, and there is distortion of history? You know, how do you correct so that the facts of history can be preserved and maintained and taught to the next generation in the right way, in the accurate way? I think that's the challenge. You know, even despite of all the international pressure and our activism and mobilization, and everyone knows, but the stubborn government when they don't recognize, like Trump in the United States, yeah. And there are governments that turn into authoritarian or repressive or not honest and deceive their people. I think that's the great challenge. The society turning into conservative and more resort to hate and discriminatory practices, and when history does not progress but goes back. I think that's a challenge of our time. I have been trying to register these Comfort Woman documents as documentary heritage of UNESCO. And again, there has been strong lobbying and interference by the Japanese government in order to build pressure, put pressure upon UNESCO so that UNESCO cannot come up with the right decision. Collective memory, I think what is important in the issue of human rights is how we collectively keep the memory in documentation, but also oral transferring in our storytelling, whatever the method in writing books, etc. But we keep this memory so that history will not be repeated. I think non-repetition of human rights violation is really important. And that is what motivated me to keep on going like this, and then working towards the UNESCO documentary heritage, so that this can be kept and preserved and maintained and used in the history lesson, in our human rights education, in peace education. Otherwise, this human rights violation, killing and raping and slavery, that will be repeated, which is not the goal of humanity. We need to preserve the document collectively, keep our collective memories, and then preserve and then transmit that to the next generation. Yeah, so that wrongdoings will not be repeated in the history. I think you can check the human rights organizations, and in every society there are human rights organizations, big or small, working in the area of domestic violence, trafficking, refugees, or discrimination against minorities, migrants. So if you are a student interested in human rights, look around and try to find civil society organizations, human rights organizations, and work as a member, volunteer, supporter of those organizations who always need new people in terms of resources, advocacy, fundraising, making laws. And I see nowadays there are many people, but we need more. What is really heartbreaking is to see how people in Myanmar are struggling nowadays. Whenever I see the news on Myanmar, that reminds me our own past in the 80s in Korea. We fought for democracy, of course, with lots of sacrifices. And I see, many people are dying, in Myanmar. But you know, look around whether there is any group in your country who is working for people in Myanmar. You know, it's not necessarily be about what's happening in your country. You can also help other countries struggle. You know, the people struggling there. Yeah. So always civil society has been the forefront of human rights struggle, and history does not come naturally. Human rights, especially human rights, is the result of our own struggle. What we are enjoying, the rights, all we are enjoying now, is the result of our ancestors' struggle.